Today's video is a step-by-step tutorial on how I built a laptop stand for myself. I destroyed my previous laptop after spilling some water on it, and I wanted my new one to have at least a fighting chance of surviving in case I did it again. I wanted to bring it off the ground. This has turned out really well. It was not totally smooth sailing. I ran into some issues. I cover those in the video, and the Chiefs lost. How about that? Hopefully you enjoy it. If you have any questions, please let me know. The first thing we're going to go over here are the dimensions, the functions I want out of this, and then kind of the form factor aesthetic. I'm relatively cheap, so for these kind of things, I just use pine, box store pine. If you have the ability to mill it flat, do that. This is a project where it's not going to be absolutely essential to do that. If you just have to use it straight off the shelf, ideally look for the best board you can in terms of flat, straight, etc. But there's only minimal joinery here, and it'll be okay if you don't have a nice, perfect, flat surface. So with that being said, I want to talk about the dimensions now. And to me, this is a blend specifically of function in terms of keeping the laptop off the table and hopefully avoiding water and crumbs and other things, as well as still being able to use it. Obviously, I think could be taller, that'd be great, but I wouldn't be able to type as well. When I'm sitting at my desk, my waist is kind of about there. I don't want to be up here, right? I kind of want to have it down here a little bit. So when I did a water test earlier of just spilling a bottle, it went all the way up with a totally full kind of 16-ounce bottle to about 5 inches of spilling. It was really high. I then took that to my desk and I kind of sat there and I looked at 5 inches and what that would be like. It was just too high for me. And so I said, okay, I can't totally avoid this, but I'm going to go somewhere in the middle. And I landed on about 2.5 inches, anything higher than that. And it just started to get awkward to type. Now that's unfortunate. I wish it could be harder, but I have to be able to use the laptop. It has to work as intended, or else what's the point in having a laptop? So 2.5 inches is going to be my front starting height. And we'll go to the board here in a bit and we'll talk about the shape and the exact dimensions. But all of this can be scaled for you. My desk is not huge depth-wise. It's relatively long, maybe about 48 inches, but it's not super deep. So I'm a bit limited there as well. And obviously I want to have other things on my desk and space underneath. So all of these dimensions are to fit my specific use. If you like the shape and the concept of this, feel free to scale it however you want to get it to fit you best. You don't have to follow my same dimensions, though I would take note of the proportions of front to back and the angle, which I will mention here as to the slope, because I think I found a pretty good angle in terms of slope for typing and then laptop opening. The shape I'm going to go with. I'm going to have 2 legs that come down on an angle, and they're just going to be squared off on the ends here. I'm not going to do anything super fancy. This is more for form, and I don't want to spend a ton of time. If you want, you can cut some bevels on this and angle it out sideways. Sort of borrowed this design from something I saw online. I'm also going to use slats going across, and I like that because of heat buildup. I want to avoid that with the laptop. I'm going to have the slats be a total of 16 inches across. This fits well on my desk, but this is going to be up to you a little bit. My laptop is a small Mac Air, so it's much tinier, but I want to have some wiggle room in case I don't set it directly in the center, so it's going 16. There will be a 1-inch overhang on either side of the slats. Therefore, these will be set inside 1 inch from the edge. Now, using my dimensions, I wanted 11.5. My desk, kind of with room in front, there was only about 12 inches that I could fit the thing within. So I went with 11.5. I'm going to have 2.5 obviously in the front and then about 4 inches in the back. And I did this just kind of by holding my laptop up and getting a feel for it. And this came out to about an 82-degree angle. 82 in the sense that if you were to draw it at a side like that, this here would be 82 degrees. I know that seems a little awkward coming from here, but that's how I derived 82, as if it was turned sideways. But overall, we don't really need to know this angle because we're going to do a tapering jig cut. So we're still ripping in a straight line and just turning the piece a little bit. But in terms of what I found to be a comfortable distance, height, and angle, it came out to about 82 degrees. Now, obviously, you could make more middle kind of legs here, but I wanted this room in the middle open, and I wanted to jut them in a little bit to leave more open space on either side of the desk, though I wanted to maintain that top kind of wider area. So this is what we're going to be working with. We're going to go ahead, we're going to get our wood cut down to length and width, and then we will go ahead and cut the bevel on it. Now you can start with whatever width you want. Obviously I need to get down to 4 inches. I just keep around 1 by 10 pieces of pine, as I like to have a nice wide starting point. So I'm going to cross cut this to 11 inches. And that brings me to something I wanted to ask. How much of the actual kind of working with the tool do you want to see on videos that aren't specifically about using a specific tool? Do you want to see these cross cuts? Obviously, I'll show anything that I think is kind of required for the build, but I don't know how much time people want of doing a rip cut or doing a cross cut or something like that. I usually only include a few seconds of each. So let me know whether that's good, whether you want more, whether you don't want any at all, and just more along the lines of the plans and the method going through. When it comes to cutting the taper, we're going to do this on a tapering jig, straight line rip jig. I built this just to rip straight lines on things. Didn't really intend to use it for tapers, didn't think I'd ever need it, and turns out actually it's pretty useful, and I've occasionally used it for that. I would build a decent size one if you're going to build one, because having capacity is really nice. Now, this would be very awkward to cut on a miter gauge, and in fact, in my case, I don't even know if it would fit based on the distance of the miter gauge to the saw blade, so we kind of have to use a tapering jig. Now, for me, I'm just going to measure 2 points. The front height that I want, 2.5, the back height that I want, 4 inches, and connect the dots. And that, like I said, just happens to be 82 degrees if we were to stand it like this. So for me, again, this is more about whatever the angle is going to fit to my measurements. And the easiest way to use the tapering jig is if you've built it with a miter bar under it, it should be right up against the blade. If you've done it like me and you just ride it on the fence, we're going to have this riding right up against the blade. We take our 2 measurements here, and we're just going to carry the lines across on both sides, and that will be our reference point for lining up with the edge. I'm going to go ahead and make that first mark and try to be accurate, though we can always kind of adjust on there. Ideally, we cut over accidentally and then can go down. We can't really go back once we have cut off too much. And then absolutely at this point, mark the outside, because when you're starting to line these up, you get kind of lost in like shimmying it to get lined up, and you can very quickly forget what you're trying to remove and what you are trying to keep. When it comes to tapering jigs and using multiple pieces, there are 2 ways you can try to do this. You can try to mark it out on all of them and eyeball it every time. You're not going to get the same exact cut each time. It's just not going to happen. The thickness of the pencil, maybe you offset it a little bit, something. It's not going to happen. But we can solve this pretty easily. I like to make my jigs out of MDF because hot glue pops on and off of there real easily. It holds nicely and you can just kind of pop it right off with a chisel. So we're going to take the one we marked out, and assuming we marked this correctly, this is going to be our reference piece. We're going to make the cut based off of this, and then everything that follows, in this case just one for me, is going to be identical to this. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your 2 lines here, and I like to try to match them exactly kind of on the inside of the edge. So I want to remove the outside of the line rather than taking the line directly out. Just my personal preference, and this takes kind of a lot of fidgeting to get it right there. But once we get it there and we're happy with the placement, we're going to go ahead and let's just say we're going there, whatever. Perfectly fine like that. We're going to grab 2 scraps of wood, hopefully that have nice kind of flat edges. And we're going to put one on the inside of this, holding this kind of outer edge here. And we're going to put one on the back end here. And then we will take our hot glue gun and we're going to hot glue these down on the outside of the pieces. And what that'll allow us to do is make that cut, undo this, slide this out, and immediately slide the next one in there. And it's going to be the same as long as you butt it up against relatively stably. Make sure to place enough hot glue on this that it doesn't kind of pop back if you hit it too hard. But otherwise, you're going to get the same cut every time. This is the, in my opinion, best way for repeatability for tapers, is to just lock the positioning in with kind of 2 stop blocks, essentially. You can also do this in 2 orders. One, you can line it up, make the cut, and if it looks right, you do not take it off. You then hot glue on your pieces, or you can line it up, hot glue them on first, go ahead and make the cut, and then you're kind of set with that. Now, if you don't trust the angle, or maybe you're not entirely sure about it, you can make the cut, look at it, then hot glue on. Just make sure that if you do it in that order and you like the cut, you do not remove this until you've glued on these 2 stop blocks. There are 2 things I want to say here. The first is make sure you set the blade height relative to this and not to this. I have made mistakes before where I've raised the blade next to this, didn't make an all the way through cut, had to go back and do it again. It's very annoying, so make sure you raise the blade relative to your workpiece. The second is that you can place this workpiece in a lot of different areas along there. And part of this is going to come down to how long your fence is. I have a really long fence. That's one of the big benefits of a cabinet saw. And I like to have as much kind of reference surface when my cut is actually being made. If you stick this all the way at the front here, we've got this large amount hanging off the back, and it gets a little awkward, which is why I've added this to really help me on longer pieces. And then conversely, if you put it way in the back here, you're already kind of getting into the saw blade when it's still kind of finishing the cut. I like, when possible, to have the workpiece in the middle so that I've got good reference by the time we engage there, and I'm already done with the cut by the time I've still got, most of this on the fence. So it's up to you, and on really long pieces, you can't really do anything about it. You're gonna have, I've had pieces sticking off of this before. It usually works pretty fine. I would also say that depending upon the angle, a crosscut blade or a rip blade can be ideal here. It really depends on how far we're getting cut as to where the fiber direction is going. I'm just using a 40 tooth because it's what's in here, and this is not, I'm not selling this project. But if you're at a more shallow angle, closer to a rip cut, a rip blade leaves a nicer surface. The more acute, I guess that's the right word, more acute the angle is, I usually throw on a crosscut blade because we're going much more across the grain. So for something like this though, there's kind of a no perfect, you're just dead in the middle between, we're not ripping, we're not really cross-cutting. So any blade, go ahead and throw that in there. I would also mention that if you are worried at all about tear out and you have a piece that you're backing here, you can stick it over the edge. Now it's only gonna work for one cut, and it's still gonna provide a little for the next cut, but you're only gonna get that perfect blocking for one cut, but you'll get essentially a zero clearance on the second one. So if you're worried about tear out, maybe your blade's a little dull, have your back piece hang over the edge, and that's gonna get you as much help as you possibly can. And here is where our kind of shape holder comes in, our stop blocks. Handy, take that out, slide it right in and right up against, and just make sure it's firm. You don't have to ram it up against there. Just look for any of the daylight to disappear. When you lock these down, make sure you don't get any movement. Sometimes they can pull a little bit and pull something away. So just take one extra look before you're done. Remember, for this, it's kind of important that they're really darn close to each other. Maybe not exact, but we really want them pretty close so we don't have to do too much, if any, kind of massaging of the bottom of them at the end to get it to sit flat. Hot glue just comes right off. It's honestly great. And it held perfectly strong. And then if you want to reuse these pieces for something, it comes right off of there as well. We've got our two angled pieces, our legs, feet, whatever you want to call them at this point, and we have one main critical choice left. The slats, how the laptop is going to sit on there. And if you, of course, can just have one solid piece of wood and it will be perfectly fine. I just want to prevent any possible overheating, so I want little gaps in the slats to give just some breathing room. Now there are two ways to look at this. One is aesthetic, and you can toy around with the spacing based on the aesthetic. Do you want thinner slats, thinner gaps, and a bunch of them, or do you want thicker slats? And by slat, I mean the piece that's going to run across, and the gap being the area in between each of those slats. For me, the new laptop I'm getting has little feet on the bottom, 4 of them. They look to be about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So I'm gonna actually go with pretty chunky slats and relatively minor gaps. I don't want the feet ever kind of dipping in there, causing any issues. So I want what seems like a flat surface with just enough gaps for some airflow underneath. I'm not as worried about the aesthetics. This is sitting in my room. It's mine. I'm not showing it off to the world other than this video, of course. So then it came to, okay, I want relatively chunky slats. Well, I'm also limited by my dimensions here, right? 2.5, 11.5 or something like that, and then 4 inches. So I had to go within that. It's a lot easier if you're working with kind of an unknown distance and you can just plan it out from there. That meant it worked out pretty well for me to have 1-inch slats, so pretty chunky, and about a 5/16 of an inch gap in between each slat. That allowed me to get not only an even amount spacing wise, but allowed me to put a slat at the very front and a slat at the very back, and I didn't have any kind of overhang gap. I'm gonna put a little lip on the front to kind of just make sure it doesn't slide off, and therefore I wanted the front slat all the way to the front so that I didn't have any kind of wasted space. I wanted the laptop as close as possible, and that's what allowed it to do that. I essentially just kind of started eyeballing and worked from there. I put one on the end, one on the front, and then just took the measurement in between and started dividing until I found something that fit well. 5/16 of an inch gap, 1-inch slats works well. For cutting the slats, there are two ways to do this. Now, I'm going to just do it on a crosscut sled, and I'm just going to move along. You can either get really professional and use either setup blocks that you make or that you have, or you can just kind of eyeball it, and as long as you're cutting both of them with a stop block, they're going to be identical. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be a lot quicker just to eyeball it and just use your marking. It's not going to be as accurate. So when you go to then cut the individual strips, you will have to cut these slightly oversized and take a hand plane swipe when needed to take it down if you're a little too tight. So you add a little time on the end, but it's a lot faster, in my opinion, than taking setup blocks, dealing with the kerf, the gap, and the slat space, and going over one by one. If you were selling this or doing something professional, it's going to be a lot, probably more even and consistent looking if you use the setup blocks. And I will talk about what we do with these to get correct setup, where we don't actually have to think about it. We just use these as the spacing. It just takes a little longer, and I want to get this done as quickly as possible. So here is how the setup blocks work. Now I've just got this marked out because I was doing the measuring. This is the top, obviously, but we will be facing down on our crosscut sled or miter gauge. And since I'm removing a front and back, I'd be starting with the front as my first cut here. And what we have to worry about here is that we can't just use 3/4 of an inch spacer and then a 5/16, etc., because we have the thickness of a blade to deal with. Now, fortunately for me, the Freud thin kerf rip blade happens to be basically exactly 3/32 of an inch. And what you have to do here is you have to account for the spacing of the 1 inch here and the 5/16 plus and minus the kerf. So if I make a cut, let's say I make a cut right on the inside of this line here. Well, if I move over 5/16 of an inch, I'm going to be on the inside of this line as well. And it will not be the gap of 5/16. I'll have 5/16 minus the kerf. So it's not going to be correct. What I have to do is take 5/16 of an inch and then add on the kerf as well. And that will move me from the inside of this line to the outside of this line. And it works really well going all the way down. Now, when you're not evenly spaced, you then need a separate cutter or separate setup block for this in-between space. And for that, once we're on the inside of this line between the two, we need that distance minus the kerf. And therefore, that ensures our saw blade ends up on the inside of this line. We want to be cutting inside, 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 inside. We never want to be cutting the line or cutting past the line. And if we were to just have a 1 inch and a 5/16 inch, we would get off by the end because we'd be adding 3/32 in the case of my blade to every cut. It just wouldn't work out mathematically and it wouldn't look right. So if you wish to do the setup blocks, and like I said, if I was selling these or doing something kind of high end or whatever, I would absolutely use these. You're going to need to start, if you are starting with a slat in the front, you will make your first cut on the inside of this line here. You will then take the distance of your gap, whatever you've chosen that to be, and you will take a setup block of that distance plus one that is the thickness of the kerf. You can make your own thickness of the kerf by cutting a piece of wood, kind of like a groove through it, and then cutting a thin piece of wood to then fit inside of that. And that will be the kerf, and it will be very thin and a little flimsy. But once you've done that, then you will take another measurement that is 1 inch minus this 3/32. You will then place that between the stop block and this piece, move it over. It will then cut the inside. And you just alternate the 5/16 plus, 1 inch minus, 5/16 plus, 1 inch minus, all the way through. And it will get you there. Now, unfortunately, if you have cut this correctly in length already, and you are off at all in your cuts, you will then not end up with a perfectly equal one on either side. And sometimes if you're not dead set on a length, you can actually trim it later and do all this gap cutting, and then at the very end shave the last one to fit well. So if you don't fully trust your ability to get these all set up correctly, but you want to use the setup blocks, it's never a bad idea to leave one end long and just cut it later at the end directly down to size. What you'll need to make sure to do is have these and pick a side that is going to be in and out, and then we're going to reference each of them off of each other so that we can make both cuts at once, sort of in one stop, move the stop block, and we're only going to cut one cut each time, and we'll come back later and just kind of clean out the rest. It takes a lot longer to do it in between. We just come back at the end. We already have our kind of guiding lines and we just remove the middle. We're going to reference our blade height off of whatever the thickness of the wood for our slats is. I ran all this through the planer at the same time, so it's all the same. If you're using wood straight from the lumber yard or Home Depot, just reference it off, pick any of the pieces, and you'll be good to go. You can go a little under if you would prefer to sand the slats down, or you can go a little over if you would prefer to sand down the middle. I'm just gonna shoot for attempting right on, and hopefully we're close. I'm gonna sand it anyways. Now, for those of you who wanna do the setup blocks, I'll just walk you through really quick one phase so that you can get a visual of exactly what I'm talking about at the sled. This is the method for using the setup blocks. We would make our first cut on the outside of our first gap. We would line it up right here. You would clamp a stop block down on the left side. You would then take 5/16 or whatever your gap is, plus the kerf, the thickness of this blade. You would then place it in between those two things, and that would slide you over to exactly the outside of that gap. Now you would make that cut. You would then grab the space of your slat minus the kerf. So for me, 1 inch minus 3/32. That then gets placed in between those, and that will leave me at exactly the inside of this guy here. And then you go 5/16 plus, slat minus, plus, minus, plus, minus. That's how it works essentially. And you have to just remember, before undoing your stop block, if it was here, you then have to move this over, place these in between, hold this down, move your stop block. At this point, we have all of our kind of boundary perimeter cuts made, whatever you want to call it. I like to then just come back with a Sharpie and just mark out all the areas that I need to remove the waste from. And then now you can just kind of speed through it because you already know where you had to cut pretty much perfectly. Now you can just remove the middle really fast. You could do this with a bandsaw or whatever you want to do to remove this, but it's just really easy to continue on the table saw and you'll get a nice depth that's equal throughout. At this point, you should now have two identical pieces with the slots for the slats cut out. I'm just going to cut the slats out. I'm going to cut based on whatever the largest one of these is. I just eyeballed this, remember? So one of these is almost guaranteed to be a little bit wider than the rest of them, and I would rather remove material than try to like fill a gap or have to mill up a whole different piece of lumber, something like that. I'm going to figure out whichever of these is a little over an inch. I'm going to set my table saw to that, and I'm going to rip everything at that just to do it all in one go. I will then plane down, just take a swipe or two with a hand plane on any of the slats for anything that's narrower. It'll be really quick. Then if you are at all concerned about kind of maybe some racking or something, you don't love that this is open, this is a good time to go back to the crosscut sled and just take out a little square right there and essentially just create a slat on the bottom. I would do it now before you go ahead and do everything else. Just get it fixed in right now before you've lowered the table saw blade height, and it will then look uniform throughout this whole thing. This would also be a cool time if you want to cut some curves out, maybe go to the bandsaw, do something there. I would do that if this was already a heavier wood, but it's already incredibly light because it's pine and I want this to have some weight to it. But if you use a nice hardwood and it's pretty dense, or you just want to play with the shape at all, head to the bandsaw, cut out some interesting curves. It could look really cool. Gonna go ahead and cut the slats out. Then we will do some sanding, some staining, some gluing, some more staining, and then some finishing. I just wanted to give you an example of the fit we are looking for here because we actually have to be kind of careful when we go to put these in. We want it to go in with hand pressure ideally. Once we put glue on there, it's going to get even tighter. And the big problem comes with these aren't particularly strong when they're staying there. So if you have this and it's extremely tight and you have to mallet, I guarantee you one of these is going to snap right off. So we want a press fit, not too tight, not too loose. We'll do just a hair of sanding before we stain to rough up the wood a little bit, but that right there is what we're looking for. Just having to press in and wiggle in just a little bit. It's not going anywhere, but it's also not so loose or not so tight that I can't get it out of there, or I'm going to have to mallet it in there, which is the worst case scenario. We can get a bit of a sneak peek right here at something close to the final. We're gonna leave the front lip till much further on in the end, right before we do finishing. That way we can kind of set our laptop down, think about the height, stuff like that, and we'll just kind of look at the aesthetic at the end as well. Once you're satisfied with the legs, we can move into the sanding and the pre-finish, pre-stain. I'm going to stain mine, of course. Now I'm going to do this in a specific order. I'm going to sand all of the undersides and the insides, and I'm going to stain those before I glue this together because it's going to be an absolute nightmare to try to get in there afterwards. But I'm not going to sand or stain the top quite yet. At the end, I'd love to just run a random orbit sander over everything in case something doesn't glue perfectly level, and then I'll just stain the top towards the end when we do the little front lip as well, and just do that kind of in one go right before the finish. I think you should probably round over the outside edges if you're going to have an overhang. Obviously, if you want to pick this up at some point, it's always nice to have just kind of that tactile feel of slightly rounded over. You can round over the front or the insides of these. I'm not going to do that. I don't like that look when it's sitting in a groove if you accidentally round over. I like it just to be nice and squared off. Now, because we've got the fit of these already done, be very careful when you're sanding not to kind of take too much off of the area that's going to make contact with our groove. We don't want them too loose. If they start getting way too loose, you may have to put dowels in at the end because you've lost some glue surface. So just kind of, even if you want to mark off the area that's going to make contact there, just to not remove too much material. This is only being held in by glue connecting on three sides. We're not slotting it into a mortise of some type or anything like that. So we need as much glue surface as we can get. This is a good time to think about what your finish and if you're doing a stain is, and then only go up to the grit that's required for that. A lot of times for sprays and stains, you're looking at 180 to 220. Some are even lower, like 150. We don't need to sand higher than whatever our finish or stain is going to be. That's just a waste of time. If you're going to do some kind of oil finish on hardwood, I like to go pretty high. I like to get an incredibly soft sheen, kind of soft feel, bright sheen. I go to 400, then quadrupolate steel wool. That's not necessary. You know, it's going to be hidden mostly by a laptop for all intents and purposes. So only go as high as either your finish or stain needs to be, or you feel comfortable spending the time to do. After you finish the sanding, if you're using a hardwood or just a wood that you want to remain the natural look, go ahead and skip to gluing this together and then the lip, and then we'll apply the finish. For those of you staining, we're now going to stain this, the undersides, the bottom, the internal, all of that. I'm leaving the top unstained because I'm going to sand it after the glue up just to make sure it's all flat. If you want to stain that now, go ahead, but then you're either going to have to restain after sanding or just kind of trust that everything is good. If you are using a softwood or a maple or something that doesn't take stain well, I highly suggest using a pre-stain conditioner. These work really well. This is from Minwax. Unfortunately, I opened mine and it's just kind of gloopy, so it's no good. It's getting tossed. But they really even things out. It makes a significant difference if you apply this correctly. Apply it liberally, wipe off after 15-ish minutes, immediately apply stain, and it will help significantly. So if you are dealing with blotchy woods or anything that doesn't take stain well, and you have the money and the time, go get a can of this. Any brand is probably fine. I've just had good success with the Minwax version. Now, I want this to be pretty dark. I want it to blend in with a dark desk and whatnot. So when I want something darker, obviously I choose a dark color to start with, but I apply a pretty liberal amount on with a brush. I let it flood and I wipe off after about 5 to 6 minutes. Any longer than that, when you're in an outdoor shed in the winter, it can start to get tacky a little fast. As soon as I apply the first one, I hit a timer on my phone, which is currently filming, and then as soon as that timer rings, I get back and I start wiping off that first one, because it will tack and it will become a real mess to get off of there. We definitely don't want that. Now, in terms of application, I think you can generally get a lighter version of your color if you kind of just dip a little rag or a towel into it and kind of rub it on, rub it in, but you're not flooding it. You're just applying the color. You can take a second to look at it. You can apply a little more. If you want a lighter tone, start by doing that, or thin it out and add either mineral spirits to an oil-based or water to a water-based and go from there. But if you want the darkest version of whatever color you're using, flood it on there 5, 6 minutes, something like that, then wipe it off. It's just going to saturate far more that way. And if it's not as dark as you want, you can always try and apply a second coat, though if you flood and let saturate, it's not going to get a whole lot darker on the second coat, so just be aware of that. You may just have to get a darker stain and step it up. I am setting these in 1 inch from the end on either side. Now, historically, I've never had any real problems wood gluing other pieces of wood to stained pieces of wood. I don't know how people feel about that. I've never had any big problems. But I do generally like to try to mark out a little area where there's going to be the contact between the two, and not cover it in stain. It's okay if some stain gets in there, but I try not to cover it. I don't know if it really matters. I just generally err on the side of, let's just have more wood-to-wood contact instead of stain, and we just don't have to worry about it at all. So if you want to take the time, just mark out roughly where these are going to intersect. Try not to stain that too much, and then when you go to glue it together, you don't have to worry about any kind of thoughts in the back of your head about whether stain is going to cause any gluing problems. I would also suggest at this point, if you have kind of had to shave some of these down to match certain ones just a little bit, keep them in order, because once we put the stain on here, it may not be obvious, or write the number them, which I am doing, and write in the area where you're trying not to stain the correct placement, because it's going to be much easier when we go to glue things together to just know which one fits where. If everything fits identical and you use the spacer block method, they're all going to fit. It doesn't really matter. It's been a couple hours and I got a little bored, so I'm going to go ahead and glue this up now. The stain is dry enough to deal with without leaving any major fingerprints. I've glued up a few things in the past that have 2 independent legs and a bunch of slats, and what I found over time is that trying to glue in one at a time is not only hard to hold these in place for the initial ones, but it's hard to then keep all of them in exact alignment. What I've stumbled upon is kind of taking 2 as like setting the boundary, and I mark off, in my case, 1 inch is what I want the overhang on either side, first with just a line, and then I apply a piece of tape over there so I get just a little edge that I can feel butting up against the 2 legs when I kind of push them out, and that lets me know that these are exactly in alignment. From there, I do not glue these in yet. I will then go through and glue all of these middle ones in. Then I will come back, do these 2, and at the very end I will do the front and the back. That way I can just even use my fingers to help keep these in alignment, and over time more of the glue will dry, and by the end I can then just press down on my fingers with these front and back ones there, and it'll be good to go. There are 2 other things I want to add here. I like to use not only wood glue but super glue, especially in cases where we can't easily just apply a clamp right away to hold it. We need some kind of temporary bond, I guess I'll call it temporary, from the super glue to help hold the slat in place while we go to the next one, to give that wood glue some time to dry. I don't own enough clamps, I don't think, to actually clamp down every single one, so it's not really an option. For clamping, I'm going to end up putting a piece of wood on top of this and then just setting a dumbbell on top of there, and that should be enough. I like to paint my glue on with a little pick. I do not want squeeze out here. It's going to be really hard to get it out of there, and I've already stained, so I can't really sand it off. I can't really take it off with a chisel because there's a good chance I'll take a little wood out. Now maybe that's not the end of the world. I can do some touch-up staining, whatever. But I like to really be precise with my glue in situations like this and just painting it on each wall individually. I'm super happy with how this glue up came out, and I kind of test ran this a little bit today to see the size and whatnot and how it worked for me. And I just want to say, my desk, when I sit at it relative to it, the desk itself is right around waist height, maybe a little above when I'm sitting down. And these dimensions worked really well for me. So depending upon the height of your desk relative to your waist when you're sitting, this may need to be a little taller or a little shorter, or depending upon the thickness of your laptop. I use a MacBook Air, it's unbelievably thin, so I don't need to lower it too much because of the laptop sticking up more. I'm not going to do a full review on this sander, but I got this a few weeks ago. I just wanted to move into something cordless. I wanted to get into a cordless line of DeWalt, and this was the first thing I got. And I just want to say I'm really happy with it. I think it works out pretty well. If you have the corded one, all I'll say, if you move to this top here is wider. It's a little bit awkward. And then the weight coming off the side is a little different. But overall, if you're looking for a cordless sander, it's not the point of this video, but I've been pretty happy with this guy. When it comes to putting the front lip on, there's both a functional and aesthetic choice. And you also have the option of doing no front lip whatsoever and just leaving it open entirely. But if your laptop has a smooth back, it's probably going to slide a little bit or just not hold itself in place. If it has rubber feet, maybe you don't need to do this, or you could put some kind of mat over it, something like that. I've mocked up a few different designs here to kind of give you an idea, just maybe some inspiration of what things can look like. I know what I'm going to do. My laptop's very thin, so I'm just having 2 little low profile things, but I'll bring you in closer and show you a bunch of different designs I got. We can do everything from something continuous to some very minimalist stuff, or something in between. We'll start with the continuous. We have just a bevel put on this, pretty low profile. Not a bad look there. Come from the side. Nice bevel, very simple. We could go with something just entirely flat, or maybe with a light round over. Very simple, low profile. If you want something kind of more distinct and large, you could go with something like this, leaving the room in the middle open to lift open the laptop. I don't love this, but somebody may want something just kind of chunkier and more standing out. We've got a slightly larger piece with a lighter bevel on it. We can then start going very minimalist, just a single piece, something like this in the middle with the ability to lift open the laptop again, allowing hands, total movement everywhere. This is the design I'm pretty sure I'm gonna go with. I may make these even a little shorter, but right now this is what I like. My laptop's just a little bit shorter than this, but I can get it open in the middle, and this should keep out of the way for my hands when I'm typing. You could go super low profile and just have this barely kind of off the ground, just part across right there. It's not going to slip off, but it is not going to be in your way at all. And then the two most minimalist I could come up with would be perhaps some little kind of triangle wedges. We just set right there. Again, it's not going to be able to fall off. Unbelievably minimalist. You can place them wherever you want across this. And I think the ultimate minimalist would be to drill two little holes, make a very thin dowel, and just have it just protruding, you know, 1/8 of an inch or less, and it would be barely visible. It would not interfere at all, but the laptop couldn't slide off. Those are just a couple of the design options you can go with. I'm going to go ahead and get this stained. I'm going to then glue the lip on, and then we'll finish it. As we near the finish line with this project, I just want to touch on two remaining things. First, it's the Saturday. Tomorrow is the Super Bowl. You're going to see this after, so you will know the result. But personally, as a Bengals fan, I empathize with everybody out there who's not a Chiefs or an Eagles fan. This is a tough day for us. We realize finally that we didn't do it this year. In fact, we may have been awful this year. Who knows? Your team may have been really close or really far away. It's kind of like being lonely on Christmas. A lot of people share in it, yet we all kind of think we're alone in that. Just know there's going to be someone else who feels terrible tomorrow. In fact, they're going to feel even worse. Either the Chiefs fans or the Eagles fans are going to feel even worse than you do now, and your team's not even playing. You didn't even make it that far. But we can all look ahead to next season. We've got the draft, the combine, all of that, and we can all believe that our team will be there next year. With that out of the way, let's just touch on finishing here. I'm gluing on my little front lips, and that'll be done, and I'll get to finishing. We've got a lot of options here. I dug out everything I have, or at least that I could find around here to talk about. It's mainly going to come down to a few factors. One, is anyone going to see this, and do you care that they see it? Two, do you need it to be scratch resistant, water resistant, anything like that? Three, do you need to get this done relatively quickly? Four, do you want to have to risk having to do a lot of work to repair the finish? For me, I want to get this done relatively quickly, and I don't want to have to do a lot of work to repair the finish, but I'm okay without having a ton of protection, and for me, that means it's going to be a lacquer. As you can see, I like to spray stuff on. I just find it easier. It's less time. I get a more even coat, but whatever you do, you don't have to spray. This will be a bit annoying to brush on or anything like that, so if you've never tried spraying, this is a good time to try it. After that, we have the two other finishes that are kind of idiot-proof to apply, take longer to dry, don't offer a ton of protection, the boiled linseed oil and the tung oil blends. Now, these are going to require at least 2 coats. You could probably do more if you want. You probably should if you're looking for protection, and go with the tung oil. You can build up a bit of a film with this over time, but again, that's time-consuming to do, and it takes a little while to dry. If you do not care about protection whatsoever, you just want to get a nice color boost, you just want to get some kind of finish on there, this is a perfect place for boiled linseed oil. Just make sure you get it all out of the crevices and cracks after you're done, after you're wiping it off, or else it'll leave some gooey residue behind. But in all honesty, I considered heavily boiled linseed oil for this. Tung oil, a little more protection, still the same application issues. This will leave more of a sheen with fewer coats than the boiled linseed oil. After that, some people love shellac. I used to use it. I use it for a few specific woods, and especially as a base coat sometimes, so I don't have to use a bunch of other stuff on porous woods. That's always an option. It's going to amber, or at least the kind of more common available ones in stores, Home Depot, places like that are going to amber things a little bit. They say clear. It's not really clear. Then after that, we have polyurethane, which is kind of the king of protection in terms of just easily accessible, easy to apply finishes, either brush/wipe on. I had trouble saying that for a few takes, or spray on. I go with oil, but what I want to warn is that if you have a color that you really like and especially if it's light, if you go with an oil-based finish, it is going to amber it. If you look at my bench here, I built this and I painted it a latex white, an actual white, because I wanted to be able to see small objects on there, and I thought white would be a pretty good idea. I then immediately thought, well, you know, I want to put like a protective finish on it of some type, something that I can wipe things off of. It's just MDF under there and plywood. I don't want water on there. So I just began applying layer after layer of oil polyurethane. And now it looks, I guess we use the word amber, but it looks like urine, to be honest. So this, if you are using a very white maple, something like that, you will get an ambering, which is what everybody calls it. Amber is a polite way of putting it. You will get an ambering to the whiter wood. So just be warned with that. There's really no huge difference, if any difference at all, in terms of protection or anything between oil and water-based polyurethane. So whatever you prefer. Obviously the oil-based stuff, when you clean it up, you have to use some kind of solvent to get it off of your hands. Water doesn't really work, and you have to let the rags dry. That includes both of these oils as well. They can spontaneously combust. So if you're looking for ultimate protection, you want to leave it pretty clear. You only want a little bit of the popping kind of the color, and you don't want to have to worry about cleaning up with any solvents or anything. Water-based polyurethane is going to be a good bet. Now, there are a bunch of other expensive kind of wipe-on oil waxes and all of that. I don't have the money to play around with those. This is all I really use. I'm going to just go with lacquer, like I said. So it's up to you, but this is a great place to use whatever finish you want, and it's going to look good as long as you apply the finish correctly, because it's a very simple piece that's just showing off the wood. Before I go out and spray this in the wonderful cold winter of the Midwest, I just wanted to show you my setup. I've been using this to spray stuff for years. This has got a disgustingly thick amount of finish on top of it from overspray. This normally all sits on top of this box and then sits on the ground, and that kind of brings it up to waist-ish height for me, which is fine. I'd like a little taller, but it's not the most stable thing in the world. This is just a piece of MDF with a Lazy Susan rotator sitting between a piece of maybe old melamine, something like that. And what I found is I like to have different things to prop items up so that I can kind of spray from different angles. So I would put this on here, set this guy on there, and now I can rotate and spray. And I've never tipped it over. I've never had a problem. I just be relatively gentle with it. And the thing I really like is that in cold weather then, I can leave this and this outside, and I can just pick this guy up, bring it into the shop, wait my 10 to 15 minutes for the coat of lacquer to dry, which is when I use lacquer. It's very quick. Bring it back outside, spray back in over and over and over again until I get between 3 to 5 coats on there. I'm going to do the top and the bottom. Now, I will say I am not particularly worried if every single square inch of the inside of these slats isn't covered perfectly in lacquer. I just want it covered to a point where when I look at it from any angle, I can't really see any unfinished spots. So I'm just going to tack it with a bunch of light coats coming at different angles, moving around, stuff like that. I don't think it's the end of the world for an inside item that's not getting heavy kind of use, that it doesn't have every single little square centimeter covered. Get yourself a perfect way to spray stuff without having to walk around and go everywhere. You can just turn, spray, turn, spray. It works great. All right, I'm gonna go brave that cold, and we will take a look at this when it's all finished. Got 2 updates after 3 to 4 coats, I think maybe 4, and 15 hours of drying, some 12 maybe, 12 to 15, something like that, and then about 7 hours of actual use today. Now I went with lacquer, and I've got some problems with it. The first was just aesthetic, and I noticed this right away. It was too much sheen for me. I don't think I've ever done lacquer and not put wax on, maybe once or twice. I always like to bring it down a bit, so that was expected. I was planning to do that or having to do that anyways. However, after taking the laptop off, I noticed 4 little spots, and I don't know if it has kind of rubbed down the lacquer, pulled it off, something, I don't know. But I instantly thought, well, I've got to warn people that there could be a problem with lacquer and the feet type. It's a Mac Air, recently new. It's got different feet than my old one, so perhaps it's something with the material there. I was doing some video editing, moderate use, but it didn't get too hot. I don't know if it was heat transferring through the feet to the lacquer. I don't know. This may be just me. Maybe it didn't fully dry as much as I'd hoped. It feels dry. Everything seemed normal, just like I always do with lacquer. But I've now got 4 spots on there, and I'm sure they're going to go away once I put wax on, and maybe it won't happen with wax, but I wanted to alert you that perhaps lacquer is not a good choice here. And I'll bring you in and show you them up front, just so you can see and decide for yourself. And then I'm going to apply wax. I'll use it again. I'm going to see if they come back and let you know how that went. All right, we've got spot 1 there, spot 2 there, and then we come down spot 3 and spot 4. And again, I don't know what that is, ignore that, but it's right here, each of them, right where the feet were setting. And I noticed it, again, the laptop was sitting there about 7 hours. It did get a little warm through some video editing. You can see though, this is just, there's too much sheen here. I'm not a huge fan of it. Well, after applying some wax, I'm much happier with the sheen level on it. It sort of helped make go away those little spots. If I really cared, I would have just sprayed a couple more layers of lacquer and redid it. I don't care. It's literally going to be under the laptop. But just be warned that if lacquer and a hot laptop and it's a Mac Air with whatever those feet, there's potential for some issues. So knowing this in hindsight, if I wanted protection, I probably would have gone polyurethane. But I personally probably would have just gone oil. I would have just BLO'd this thing like I do 90% of what I make, and I would have stuck with that, and I bet I wouldn't have had any issues. But I wanted just a little bit of protection, and I wanted it quick, and I got a little greedy, so I went with lacquer. Don't know if the issue is my laptop specifically, or if it's going to be an issue with any laptop and the heat coming out of it and the lacquer. I can't tell you that. Hopefully though, you are not dead set on lacquer and you're a little flexible and can go with something else. Overall though, I'm absolutely thrilled with how this turned out. It looks good. It's gonna match with my relatively dark desk well. It's at the right height for me. So this is a huge success. You know, like I said, if I was selling this, I would have kind of done a little more in terms of perfection, and well, it wouldn't be sellable now given the kind of problems with the feet, but overall, perfectly fine for me. Super happy. Let me know how yours goes, if you make any tweaks, if you find a different size or something that works better in terms of ratio front to back. And if you use a different finish and it works out, absolutely please put it in the comments what you used and how it did. Thanks for joining me today. This was a lot of fun and hopefully it gives you some help. Bye.